In the autumn of 1887, the livery stable on the south edge of Caldon Flats, Wyoming Territory, went up for sale with one condition attached to it, like a rusted hinge that would not swing free. The widow, who had operated the place for 11 years, offered it at a price low enough that 3 separate buyers had come out from Laramie to look, and all 3 had walked away. The condition was this: the back stall, the one at the far end of the aisle behind a plank door, secured with a padlock no one in Caldon Flats claimed to own a key for, was to remain locked in perpetuity, not sealed, not boarded. Locked in the specific sense of the word. The new owner could do as they wished with the rest of the building and the yard and the trough and the hayloft above. But the back stall was not to be touched, entered, or inquired about. The widow would say nothing more on the subject. She had said what she had said, and that was the whole of it. The 3 buyers from Laramie were businessmen with ledgers in their heads. They understood, each of them, that a condition without explanation is a condition with something to hide. They tipped their hats and rode back north. The stable sat empty through October and into November, its sale listing growing older on the board outside the land office, until a woman named Cora Vane came through Caldon Flats on the Cheyenne Road with a lame horse, $43, and a worn leather satchel in which she carried the tools of her trade. Cora was 27 years old. She had grown up in the smith shops and lock yards of eastern Kansas, the only child of a man named August Vane, who had been a locksmith of considerable reputation before the consumption took him in the spring of 1883. August Vane had not believed in keeping his knowledge to himself. He had taught his daughter to read a lock the way a careful person reads a letter, attending not only to the surface meaning, but to what the mechanism implied about the hand that had made it and the hand that had last turned it. He had taught her that every lock was a record, that every lock told the truth about something, if you had the patience to ask it the right question. Cora had been working her way west for 2 years, doing lock repair, key cutting, and save work for mining companies and express offices along the territory routes. She was not looking for a livery stable. She was looking for a farrier who could look at her horse's left foreleg without charging her more than she had in her coat pocket. What she found instead was the sale listing and, beside it, a hand-lettered rider that named a condition. She stood in front of that board for a long time in the cold November air. She had learned a thing from her father that the 3 buyers from Laramie had not known to ask. A padlock on a stall inside a livery stable was not a structural element. It was not there to keep the stall from escaping. A padlock of that kind, maintained in that location, meant that someone had put something inside the stall and required it to stay there out of other people's hands, for reasons they could not afford to name aloud. The widow's condition was not eccentricity. The widow's condition was fear. Cora paid for the listing and went to find the widow. Marit Hullis was a compact woman of perhaps 60, with hands that had done real work and a face that had weathered the specific way that grief and stubbornness together will weather a face. She lived now in a single room above the dry goods store, having moved out of the house behind the stable when her husband, Edmund Hollis, had died 6 years before. She offered Cora no tea and no chair. She stated the condition again, word for word, as if she had recited it many times and intended the repetition to function as a wall. Cora asked only one question. She asked what type of padlock was on the door. Marit Hollis's expression shifted in a way that was too small for most people to read. Cora read it. The widow knew the make of that lock. She knew it the way you know a thing you have looked at for years and refused to touch. "A Sargent and Greenleaf," Marie said. "A heavy one. The kind with the double-bolt shackle." Cora nodded. She made no other remark. She offered $38 for the property, which was $5 less than the asking price, but more than the widow had expected to get, given the 3 failures. Murray took it. She signed the deed at the land office that afternoon and walked back to her room above the dry goods store, without looking at the stable as she passed it. If you've ever stood in an unfamiliar place that has been holding a secret for a long time, you may know the particular quality of the quiet that accumulates there. It is not ordinary quiet. It is the kind that has weight and substance, the kind that presses against your ears when you step into it, as if the air itself has been waiting in one position for too long and does not yet know how to move again. That was the quiet inside the Hollis livery stable when Cora stepped through the front doors for the first time as its owner. The building was sound in its bones. The Hollis family had kept it well in the years they had operated it, and even the 6 months of vacancy since Murray had shuttered the doors had not done serious damage beyond a settled layer of dust and the intrusion of a mouse colony into the hayloft. The stalls along the main aisle were 8 in number, open-fronted with rope ties and worn wooden mangers. The tack room off the east wall held its hooks and its smell of old leather and linseed. And at the far end of the aisle, where the building extended an additional 12 feet beyond the last open stall, a plank door hung in a frame of heavier lumber than the rest, closed by means of a chain and a padlock the size of a grown man's fist. Cora walked the length of the aisle without hurrying. She looked at the door from 6 feet away, then from 3, then crouched and studied the padlock at eye level. It was a Sargent and Greenleaf No. 4, exactly as the widow had named it, made in Rochester, New York. Heavy brass casing with an iron shackle, the double bolt mechanism that required the key to work both bolts simultaneously, or the shackle would not lift. It was old, but not neglected. Someone had oiled it, and not so very long ago. The keyhole was clean. There was no rust in the throat of the mechanism. That detail sat with Cora through the rest of that first day, as she swept and took stock and negotiated with the farrier, 2 streets over about her mare's foreleg. A lock that has been oiled in a building that has been shuttered is a lock that someone visited after the shuttering. The widow had maintained it. She had come back to that door in the empty building in the months since she had stopped operating the stable, and she had oiled the lock, not to keep the lock alive, to keep the secret inside the door alive. That distinction mattered. Cora had no intention of forcing the lock. A Sargent and Greenleaf No. 4 would not yield to force, in any case without destroying either the shackle or the door, and she had no interest in destruction. What she wanted was the key or the ability to cut one, and for that she needed to examine the mechanism. In her satchel, she carried a set of pick tools her father had made for her from a Sheffield steel blank, each one ground to his particular specifications. Over the course of an evening, she had been 12 years old and was allowed to sit at the bench and watch. She carried a tension wrench set in 3 weights. She carried 2 lock gauges, a depth gauge, and a follower pin from a worn-out cylinder her father had given her to practice on. She had rebuilt 19 locks from damaged or keyless condition in the past 2 years, and had cut keys for 11 of them from scratch, using the gauge readings to machine the key blank at whatever smithy or machinist shop was willing to lend her a filing vise. She did not pick the Sargent and Greenleaf that first evening. She read it. She inserted her lightest tension wrench, applied the smallest possible pressure, and moved a single pick across the pin stack, feeling for binding pins and learning the shape of the key she would eventually need. The mechanism told her what it knew. The key had 5 cuts. The binding order moved back to front. The 3rd pin was set slightly high, a manufacturing variance that was common in number 4s from the early 1882s, which placed this lock's manufacture somewhere in the first half of that decade. She released the tension and withdrew the tools, and stood in the aisle in the last of the afternoon light that came through the dusty, high window above the tack room door. She thought about what it meant that Edmund Hollis, who had died in 1881, had put this lock on this door, and that his widow had oiled it for 6 years after his death, and that the condition of its sale was not that the stall be opened by the new owner, but that it not be opened at all. There are questions a person carries quietly until the right answer presents itself. Cora was practiced at that kind of patience. She slept that night in the tack room on a bedroll she had carried from Cheyenne, and she let the question rest. She spent the first week in honest work. The stable needed a paying trade before it needed any other thing from her, and she had $38 less in her pocket than she had arrived with, which was a precise and urgent fact. She opened for business on the second day and put a hand-lettered board at the road. By the end of the week, she had 3 horses boarded, a 4th coming in the following Monday, and a standing arrangement with the freight office 2 blocks north to stable their relay animals on the nights the late coach came in. The income was not generous, but it was real. She also, during that first week, made the acquaintance of a man named Pell, who ran the feed supply across the yard and had known the Hollis stable since before Edmund Hollis had built it. Pell was perhaps 70, with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who had survived a hard life by not rushing any part of it. He came over on the 3rd morning with a sack of oats. He said he had pulled for the previous operator and never collected on, which Cora understood to be his way of asking a question without asking it. She accepted the oats and offered him a fair price for them, and he said he would take it in trade if she ever needed extra labor, and they shook on that. He lingered by the aisle door longer than the transaction required. His eyes moved, as her own eyes had moved, to the far end of the building. "You going to leave that be?" Pell said. "Or are you going to open it?" It was not entirely a question. Cora considered him for a moment. "I own the building," she said. "That is a fact," Pell said. "I do not own a thing inside that stall," she said, "until I know what is inside it." Pell looked at her with an expression that suggested he had lived long enough to find this reasoning both uncommon and correct. He said he had not known Edmund Hollis well, but he had known him enough to know that Hollis had worked for the Wyoming Territorial Land and Title Company in Laramie before he had come to Calden Flats and built the stable, and that he had left that employment under circumstances that Pell had never understood. That was all he knew. He said it plainly, as if laying a single board without knowing yet what it would be part of. Cora filed the information and thanked him, and Pell went back across the yard. On the 8th day, a Saturday, Cora rode to Laramie. She used the county recorder's office there, which was open until noon on Saturdays, and she spent 3 hours with the index of land transfers filed between 1876 and 1882, which were the years immediately before and after Edmund Hollis had moved to Calden Flats. The recorder's staff left her alone with the ledgers, which was the customary treatment for anyone who arrived at the recorder's office, knowing what they were looking for. Cora knew what she was looking for. She was looking for Edmund Hollis's name, and for the name of the Wyoming Territorial Land and Title Company, and for any place where those 2 names appeared on the same instrument. She found it in the 4th ledger she pulled, in the recording year, 1879. The Wyoming Territorial Land and Title Company had filed 14 land transfer instruments in Laramie County in that year. 11 of them were ordinary purchases and sales of ranch and grazing land, properly executed with correct legal descriptions, signatures, and witnessing notations. 3 of them were something else. The three divergent instruments each carried the same structure: a transfer from a named private party, a ranch family, or a homestead claimant, to the Wyoming Territorial Land and Title Company, recorded as a voluntary sale at a stated price. But in each of those three instruments, the legal description of the property transferred was materially different from the legal description that appeared on the original patent filed for that same land at the Federal Land Office, which Cora had cross-referenced against the General Land Office Index the recorder's assistant had pulled for her without being asked. The acreage named in the transfer was in each case larger than the acreage that had actually been patented. The excess was not a small error of survey. It ran between 40 and 80 acres on each instrument. It was systematic. Edmund Hollis had been the recording clerk for those three instruments. His signature appeared in the attestation block of each one. Cora sat with that for a long moment in the quiet of the recorder's room, the ledger open on the table and the afternoon light coming gray through the high window. Three families had each conveyed more land than they owned, which was legally impossible unless the description had been altered between the time the seller signed and the time the instrument was recorded. Altered by the man who recorded it, whose signature appeared at the bottom of each page. She copied the relevant entries in careful longhand into the small notebook she carried in her coat pocket. She noted the names of the three selling parties, the dates of recording, the discrepant acreage figures, and the General Land Office patent numbers she had cross-referenced. She closed the ledger and returned it to the shelf and thanked the recorder's assistant and rode back to Calden Flats in the early dark, the cold coming down off the mountains with the particular finality of November in the high country. She understood now what was in the back stall, not the mechanism of the lock. She had already read the mechanism. She understood now the reason the lock was there and the reason Marette Hollis had oiled it for 6 years and the reason the widow had written the condition into the sale rather than simply destroying whatever was behind the door. Marette had known. She had known what her husband had done, and she had known what he had kept, and she had been maintaining the secret not out of loyalty to his memory, but out of a fear she could not name to anyone and could not resolve by herself, and she had sold the building rather than live any longer in the condition of that unresolvable thing. The lock was not keeping the secret in. The lock was keeping the widow out. Cora spent Sunday making a key. She had done this before from gauge readings alone, and she had done it without error. And she did it now with the same methodical care, using the filing vise she had borrowed from the smithy on the north edge of town. The blank was a heavy brass, number 4 blank she had found in her own stock, the correct profile for a Sargent and Greenleaf. She cut the 5 bidding positions from her depth gauge measurements, checking each cut with a feeler gauge and adjusting with a needle file where the reading was not exact. The work took 4 hours. She tested the key in the throat of the padlock 3 times with the door still closed before she applied turning pressure, not from hesitation, but from the practice of precision her father had taught her, the understanding that a key that binds and forces will damage a mechanism and obscure what the mechanism was trying to tell you. On the 4th insertion, she applied even turning pressure in the correct direction, and the double bolt gave way in sequence. First the secondary bolt, and then the primary, with a clean double click that she felt in the bones of her hand. The shackle lifted. She removed the chain from the door and set it on the ground beside her and opened the stall. The air that came out was cold and still and carried the smell of old paper and cedar, and beneath those, the faint mineral smell of dried ink. The stall was dark. She had brought a lantern and she raised it now and held it at the height of her shoulder and looked. The stall had been converted. There was no manger, no hay, no evidence that an animal had ever stood in the space. Instead, along the left wall, Edmund Hollis had built a set of low shelves from cedar planks, and on those shelves, arranged in flat stacks with oilskin covers that had kept the worst of the damp away, were ledger books, 11 of them by Cora's count. And on the shelf beside the ledgers, wrapped in the same oilskin, a flat bundle of papers that she knew even before she opened them would be the original instruments. The versions with the original legal descriptions, the ones that had existed before the figures had been altered. She did not disturb anything that night. She stood in the lantern light and looked at what Edmund Hollis had kept, and she thought about why he had kept it. A man who alters instruments for a land company and then keeps the originals is not a man who has made peace with what he has done. He is a man who has carried the proof of it away with him like a stone he cannot put down, who has maintained the evidence of his own transgression because he cannot bring himself to destroy it, who has built a locked stall in his own livery stable and serviced the mechanism annually and put a condition on the sale of the building that would, he must have hoped, keep the door closed until he himself was long past the reach of consequence. Edmund Hollis had been dead for 6 years. The Wyoming Territorial Land and Title Company was still operating in Laramie. The 3 families whose land descriptions had been inflated in those instruments had, in Cora's reading of the recorded transfers, received the stated purchase price for the acreage they actually owned, and nothing more, while the company had recorded title to acreage those families had never conveyed, and likely never known they had lost. Cora closed the stall door and put the chain back through the hasp. She did not relock it. She spent Monday writing a letter. She wrote it to the Wyoming Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, addressed to the Office of the Surveyor General, which was the appropriate receiving office for a complaint regarding discrepancies between recorded land transfer instruments and original federal land patents. She described what she had found in the recorder's ledgers in Laramie County, named the 3 instruments by recording date and book number, and stated that she believed she had located a set of original instruments and supporting documents that predated the alterations. She offered to provide the materials to the appropriate authority upon request. She also, before she sealed the letter, wrote separately to the county recorder in Laramie and asked whether any of the 3 selling families had registered a subsequent address or inquiry in connection with the transferred parcels. It was a long shot, but it was the kind of question a careful person asked before assuming there was no one left to restore anything to. She mailed both letters on Tuesday morning and returned to the business of running the stable. The response from Laramie came in 12 days. The county recorder had found in the correspondence files a letter dated 1883 from a woman named Dessie Crane, who had identified herself as the daughter of Harlan and Nora Crane, whose ranch had been among the 3 transferred properties. Dessie Crane had written to ask whether there was any record of what had happened to a parcel of land her family had sold to the Wyoming Territorial Land and Title Company in 1879, because the price they had received had seemed to her, in retrospect, disproportionately low for the acreage her father had always described as belonging to the property. She had received no meaningful reply. The recorder included her address, which was in Cheyenne. The response from the Surveyor General's office took longer. It arrived in the 3rd week of December, by which time the stable had a full house of boarded horses, and Cora was earning enough to begin planning small improvements to the building. The letter was formal and careful in its language, which was the language of an office that understood it was being asked to do something its predecessor officers had not done, and that was uncomfortable with the specificity of what it was being asked to do, but that could find no lawful reason to refuse. It asked her to hold the materials in their current condition and make no further alterations to the stall. It stated that an investigator from the Territorial Land Office would be dispatched to Calden Flats within the month to examine the document. The investigator, a young man named Fairweather, with a precise manner and ink-stained fingers, arrived in January. He spent 2 days in the back stall with the ledgers and the oilskin-wrapped originals, and he took careful copies of everything. He was not a man who expressed opinions, but Cora observed that he looked at the discrepancy instruments for a long time, and that his mouth went thin and flat in a way that suggested he was doing the arithmetic in his head and not finding it comfortable. On the second afternoon, Cora told him about D.C. Crane. She gave him the address the county recorder had found. Fairweather wrote it in his notebook without comment. When he left the following morning, he took his copies and left the originals undisturbed in the stall, which was the appropriate thing to do if the originals were to serve as evidence in a formal proceeding. He said, on his way out, that her patience and care in this matter had been noted and was appreciated. She thanked him and watched him ride north. She did not ask what would come next. The machinery of the land office would move slowly, and with the specific gravity of institutions that know they are correcting something. They should have caught when it happened, and it would not be quick, and it would not be announced, and no one would be thanked in the public record. But it would move. The evidence was too clear, and too complete, and too carefully preserved to be set aside. What moved before the land office machinery was the letter she wrote to D.C. Crane. She wrote it on a Sunday in February, seated at the small table she had moved into the tack room and now used as a desk. She stated plainly what she had found and what she had reported. She stated the approximate additional acreage she believed the Crane family's conveyance had encompassed beyond what the original patent had described, which was 52 acres, and noted that the Territorial Land Office investigation was ongoing. She wrote it in the plain declarative style her father had always used when he wrote to clients, the style that trusted the reader to understand what they were being told without being steered toward a particular response. She received D.C. Crane's reply in March. D.C. Crane was 41 years old and had 3 children and a husband who worked for a freight company in Cheyenne. Her father had died in 1885. D.C. had always believed, she wrote, that something had not been right about the sale of the ranch because her father had spoken of it in the last years of his life with a specific kind of sadness, not the sadness of a man who regretted a decision, but the sadness of a man who believed something. She had written to the county recorder in 1883 because she had not known where else to write. She had received no answer that told her anything. She wrote that she had not expected, after all these years, to receive a letter that said anything concrete. The territorial investigation was completed in the summer of that year. The Wyoming Territorial Land and Title Company settled with the 3 families, or with their heirs, in instruments that were recorded in Laramie County in September. The settlements were not publicized. The amounts were not named in the recorded instruments, which used the language of mutual agreement and equitable resolution that land offices preferred when the alternative was the language of fraud. The Wyoming Territorial Land and Title Company continued to operate. Its principals were not named in any proceeding. The wrong was not answered with a loud reckoning. It was answered in the older, quieter way, the way of a ledger brought back into balance by adding what had been subtracted, column by column, until the sum was right. Pell came across the yard one morning in September, when the investigation was resolved, carrying nothing this time, just himself, and stood at the stable door for a moment before he said what he had come to say. "Heard something came out of Cheyenne," he said. Cora was replacing a worn rope tie on the 3rd stall. She finished the knot before she looked up. "It did," she said. Pell nodded. He looked toward the far end of the aisle, where the plank door to the back stall now stood open during the day. She had decided, after Fairweather had taken his copies and the investigation had been formally filed, that there was no reason to close it again. The stall was a good stall. It had shelves and a level floor, and no evidence of dry rot. She had moved the ledgers and the original instruments into a flat cedar chest the territorial office had provided for the purpose of formal evidence storage, which now sat in the land office in Cheyenne. The stall itself she had converted to a storage room for the stable's equipment, hanging hooks on the cedar shelving and storing her farrier's tools and the extra rope ties and the cans of leather oil there. It was the most ordinary room in the building now. It smelled of cedar and lanolin and rope. It was useful. Edmund Hollis kept those papers, Pell said. Not quite as a question. He did, Cora said. Pell was quiet for a moment. Don't know what to make of that. Cora hung the replacement tie on the manger post and picked up the next length of rope. He did a wrong thing, she said, and he could not put down the evidence of it. That is its own kind of accounting, I suppose. Pell considered this with the deliberate patience that was his particular quality. He nodded once, a slow and complete nod, the kind that means a thing has been weighed and found to stand. He crossed back to his feed store without further conversation, and Cora went back to the rope tie, working the knot with the muscle memory that any practiced hand develops for the work it has done many times. And the stable was quiet around her, with the ordinary useful quiet of a building that has given up its secret and found no particular use for silence anymore. In the spring of the following year, a letter arrived from Desi Crane. It was not a long letter. She said that the settlement money had allowed her husband to purchase a partial interest in the freight company, which had been a thing they had worked toward for several years. She said that she sometimes thought about her father and the particular sadness she had named in her first letter, and that she found she could think about it now with less weight than before, because she understood at last what it had been. She thanked Cora for writing to her. She said she did not expect she would ever pass through Calden Flats, but that she thought of her as the kind of person her father would have been glad to know. Cora set the letter on her desk and looked at it for a while. Then she folded it and put it in the flat cedar box she kept under the desk alongside the notebook from the Laramie recorder's office and the copy of the deed for the stable in her own name, $38 and 11 years of Murray Hollis's life behind it, and a back stall that had held what it held until the right hands came to open it. The mare's foreleg had healed completely by December of the first year. By the following spring, she was the finest horse in the Calden Flat stable, and Cora rode her on the Laramie Road without difficulty. They were out early most mornings, when the light came flat and clean across the high grassland, and the mountains to the west were pale against the sky, and the stable behind them was full and warm, and smelled of hay and horses and cedar oil, and the back door stood open to whatever the day needed from it. A padlock, Cora's father had told her once, is only as honest as the hand that closes it. He had meant this as a caution against assuming that a locked thing is a protected thing, that the mechanism itself is neutral and does not know what it is asked to guard. She had remembered it all her working life as a technical observation about the limits of mechanical security. She thought now that he might have meant something more, that the lock is the keeper of a choice, that the lock carries the weight of the choice forward in time, holding it steady against the ordinary dissolution that time performs on most human decisions, until someone comes along who has learned to ask what the lock is trying to say. She had asked. The lock had answered. The answer had been enough. That observation returned to her across the years in different forms, as observations of that particular kind tend to do, surfacing when the moment calls for them, and receding when it does not. She thought of it the day a man came to the stable in the second autumn of her tenure there, a man who had ridden down from the Laramie Road with a horse that had thrown a shoe and a temper that was still running hot from the inconvenience. He looked at her and asked, not rudely but with the specific presumption that men sometimes carry without noticing it, whether the farrier was in. She said, She was the farrier. He looked at her the way those men always looked at her, which was a look she had long since learned to receive without answering it, the way a wall receives weather. She shod his horse with the same care she gave to any animal, checking the hoof wall and the angle and the fit of the shoe before she nailed it. And when she was done, he paid without a word and rode out, and she put the coin in her apron pocket and went back to the work she had been doing before he arrived. She had been doing that all her life, receiving the look and going back to the work. The work was the argument. Her father had always said, "You did not need to win the argument if you had already done the work." She thought of it again a few months later, when Murray Hollis came into the stable on a Tuesday morning in November, 2 years to the month from the sale. Cora was in the tack room working an oil rag along a set of driving lines she had taken in for repair, and she heard the door and came to the aisle. Murray Hollis stood just inside the front doors, with her hands at her sides, and her face composed in the particular way of a person who has rehearsed an expression and is now wearing it. The backstall door was open, as it was every day now, propped with a cedar wedge against the jamb, and through it she could see the hanging tools and the ordered shelving and the winter light coming from the high vent slit in the gable end. Cora did not say anything. She waited, which was the courteous thing and also the correct thing. Marit's rehearsed expression held for a moment and then released, not into anything dramatic, but into something quieter, a settling, the way a face looks when a breath has been held for a very long time and is finally let go. "I knew he had kept something," Marit said. "I did not know what. He never told me what, only that it was there and that it was not to be opened." She paused. "When he died, I was afraid of it, whatever it was. I thought perhaps it was something that would harm us, harm the name. I kept oiling the lock because I could not decide what else to do with a locked thing that I was afraid of." Cora thought about what to say and said what was true, which was that the papers inside had been preserved well by the oilskin and the cedar shelving, and that the preservation had made a difference in what the territorial office had been able to accomplish. Marit received this without expression. "He was not a wicked man," she said. "He made a wicked choice, and then he spent the rest of his life carrying it. I knew, the way a wife knows without being told, that he was carrying something. I did not know the shape of it. The shape of it was a key. He did not cut for anyone," Cora said. Marit looked at her. There was something in that look that was not gratitude exactly, but was in the neighborhood of gratitude. The way a person looks when they have been offered a way of understanding a thing they have lived beside for years, without being able to name. She left a few minutes later without ceremony, pulling her coat close against the November air, and Cora watched her cross the yard and go back up the street toward her room above the dry goods store. She did not know whether Murray Hollis slept better after that conversation or worse, or whether the conversation had made any difference to her at all in any lasting sense. That was not Cora's to know. What she knew was that the stall was open, and the work was done, and the debt that could be settled had been settled, and the debt that could not be settled, the irreversible cost of the years the three families had spent not knowing what had been taken from them. That debt was of the kind that does not resolve but only becomes, over time, a fixed historical truth that the world carries forward in the record. Pell died the following spring quietly and at home, which was the death he had been working toward his whole life, with a particular methodical patience that was his way of approaching most things. His nephew came down from Laramie to settle the feed supply and found, in Pell's desk, a promissory note from Cora that Pell had never called in. Cora settled the note in cash without being asked, because Pell had given her information she had needed in her first week and had done it without calculation, and that was a kind of labor that deserved its accounting. The feed supply was sold to a man from Cheyenne who operated it well enough, but without the specific quality of attention that Pell had brought to it, which was the quality of someone who had watched a place grow and knew its history the way you know a piece of ground you have walked over for decades. Not from documentation, but from the body's accumulated knowledge. That quality does not transfer with a deed. It ends with the person. The yard across from the stable was a good feed supply under the new owner, and nothing more. And Cora missed Pell in the practical way. She missed useful things, the way she missed a good file when a file broke and she had not yet replaced it. The Hollis stable became, over the following years, a known quantity in Calden Flats in the specific way that establishments become known when they do their work reliably and without incident. There was no drama in its reputation. It was simply the place you brought your horse if you wanted it properly cared for, and the place you brought a lock if you could not find the key, because the woman who ran it had taken on a small but steady trade in lock and mechanism, repair that she conducted from the tack room on slow afternoons. This had been the case since her first months there, when 3 separate customers had seen her tools and asked if she could look at something for them, and she had said yes, because the work was the work, and she saw no reason not to do it. She cut a total of 9 replacement keys in her first 3 years in Calden Flats. She repaired 14 locks, 2 of them from safes, one of them a padlock on a grain bin that a rancher had lost the key to in the spring planting rush and could not afford to lose the use of until a replacement arrived from Cheyenne. None of these jobs was as consequential as the sergeant and Greenleaf No. 4 at the end of the aisle. Most jobs were not. The sergeant and Greenleaf had been the exception, not in the difficulty of the mechanism, but in what the mechanism was keeping, and what keeping it had cost, and what opening it had returned. That was the nature of the work her father had given her. Not every locked thing held a wrong. Most locked things held only what they were supposed to hold, nothing more. A granary against vermin, a toolbox against casual theft, a strong box against the ordinary uncertainties of frontier commerce. But every locked thing held a choice that someone had made at the moment of the locking, and the lock preserved that choice in working order against the passage of time, and the person with the right hands and the right patience could ask the lock to give the choice back, and the lock would answer, not always with something as large as what Cora had found in the back stall, but always with the truth of what had been closed away and what it had cost to close it. Her father's tools hung on the cedar shelf in the converted back stall, cleaned and oiled and precisely ordered on their hooks, the pick set in its leather roll at the left, the tension wrenches in their graduated sizes beside it, the depth gauge and the follower pin and the Sheffield blank stock in the flat tin that had been her father's own and still had his initials scratched into the lid. She had not bought new tools when old ones wore beyond repair. She had repaired them, or adapted them, or replaced only the specific element that had failed, so that the set remained, in most of its parts, the set her father had built across the years of his working life. It was economy and it was accuracy, and it was the understanding that a tool made to a particular specification by a particular hand carries in its geometry something that a mass-produced replacement does not carry, and that you do not give that up without cause. The lantern she had used to look into the stall on that first evening hung now by the tack room door, refilled and trimmed and ready, as it had been every night since her first week in the stable, because a working stable is a place where light is needed at irregular hours. She had not thought of it as a marker of anything. It was a lantern in its right place. But sometimes, in the last of the evening when the horses were settled and the doors were closed, and she made her final check of the building before she went to her room. She passed the lantern on its hook, and the light it held caught the brass of her father's tools on their cedar shelf through the open back stall door. And the whole long aisle of the building was quietly, usefully illuminated. It was enough.